This is chapter 23 from Ekeland County. It's entitled A Need for Stories. It had been a long evening, and Frank couldn't see it lasting much longer. There were already indications that she wasn't interested. He wouldn't have felt right continuing, but they had ordered their dinners, so they couldn't leave. So, I just hated it when JT called and invited me to this party, but I had, this huge test the next day. Who had thought that he and this girl would work together? But so, I go, and it was awesome. What was this girl's name anyway? Staring at her provided no clue, but Frank could have guessed that her name was something like Stephanie or Tiffany or Mandy. It was something that ended with a Y. Frank was sure of that, or at least an E sound. Her hair was that fashionable shortcut that curled just between her ears and her shoulders, and the highlights were appropriately spaced. And her eyebrows, something Frank noticed in every girl, her eyebrows were perfectly groomed, testifying to hours of plucking and pricking and trimming and shaping. And all that to crown green eyes that would have held their own under a pair of caterpillars or a unibrow. You're really quiet. Did you know that? Frank grinned. It's just that you're so interesting. I like your stories. He knew this would cause her to melt if she was anything like other girls he knew. It did. That's very nearly the sweetest thing anyone has ever said to me, she said, and stroked her perfect eyebrow. And isn't that the best way to know someone? Through their stories? Our stories are who we are, right? I'm really glad Daryl set this up. You seem like a great guy. Daryl. That would be who would get the blame when he got home. So, what kind of hobbies do you have? Frank opened his mouth to share just as the waiters arrived. So, fajitas for the lady and rice and beans for the gentleman. Could I bring you any ketchup or anything? Frank wondered where the ketchup would go. The waiter retreated to the other side of the restaurant, smug with the service he provided, and Girl E tore into her food with gusto. Frank stared at his for a second and poked it with a fork. The dried, refried beans stuck to the fork. He remembered Anna's beans. They were delicious, the best he'd ever tasted, always served on a chipped plate. And as he thought of Anna, all the memories of her son, Manuel, flooded back. So, one of the things I hate is taking public everywhere. I hope my internship produces a good summer job for me this year because I need a new car. Bus drivers suck. Manuel's mother was walking by the side of the road, a basket of plátanos balanced on her head, following the same path she always took home. It was a busy road. 1 or 2 buses traveled it in addition to the motorcycles and dilapidated pickups that were the staples of Nicaraguan transport. The road wasn't dangerous, but there was one curve where the right side dropped into the river and the left climbed its cliff face. Anything or anyone traveling on the road had to use the asphalt around that curve. Not only do they hit on you, but they are terrible drivers. They're always going too fast or running over curbs. Nicaraguan buses were school buses rejected for U.S. students. The buses were repainted reds and greens and blues to cover the yellow, the mufflers removed and the seats taped over before becoming intercity transport. Drivers made a decent living lying about the number of fares they collected, but this damaged their reputations as honestable, reliable folks. They weren't trained operators, and the number of accidents was high. Frank used to ride with an attitude like a bull rider possessed. Like this one driver, he killed a guy last year, some old man trying to cross the road, and he's still driving, she gushed with the emotional impact of her own indignant outrage. A breathless, barefoot girl brought word to Manuel's home, and Frank and Manuel had arrived together, panting and sweaty in the humid afternoon sun. Anna lay mangled amidst the pieces of the crushed basket and the sticky smear of plátanos. Manuel had turned from the body and was walking down the road when Frank looked away from the woman who had been like his mother. I can't imagine how that old man's family must feel. Maybe he was alone in life and no one noticed when he disappeared. Manuel returned the next day, a soggy burlap sack in his left hand and a bloody machete in his right. Not even the gringo asked what he had done. And another thing I don't get, she continued without pause, is how these Amish ride their horses and buggies all the way into the city. Manuel and Frank had ridden out on horses that same afternoon. They purchased them from Manuel's uncle, Antonio. Antonio sent them with his blessing, an 80-year-old rifle with 3 rusty bullets, and a canteen of moonshine. Frank's host father watched as he packed his backpack and said nothing as they walked out the door. The pair rode the horses straight into the mountains. For 3 hours, until the bony beasts were lathered and staggering from exhaustion. I mean, their customs just make them do some strange things sometimes. Antonio cried himself to sleep that night beside the burlap bag. Frank was awakened the next morning by the ring of a gunshot. Green and yellow and blue birds washed out of the trees as the echo passed back and forth between the mountains. But I guess everyone has their own weird beliefs, right? It took Frank nearly half an hour to find the body in a grove of slick bark trees known locally as Indios Desnudos, naked Indians. Manuel had tried to swallow the rifle, and the bullet had torn a hole between his shoulder blades that a hubcap wouldn't have covered. So, I'm thinking about majoring in communications. You majored in Spanish, right? Frank nodded with finality. He had carried Manuel to the horses, which shied at the smell of the blood. He rode back to the village with Manuel's body wrapped in a sleeping bag. The family of the bus driver was waiting in Manuel's house when he arrived, and they took the bloody burlap sack and Manuel's body still in Frank's sleeping bag. Because, I mean, the essence of life is the stories we tell, and if we don't have any way to continue telling those stories, they are lost. Frank and Antonio went that night and recovered Manuel's charred body. It smelled of urine. Do you know any good stories to tell? Frank shook his head. Nothing to tell. You would have never made it as a communications major then. A communication major needs good stories. Frank nodded.